There was once a boy named Eli, who grew up believing he was the weakest person in his village. He wasn't born believing this. Somewhere along the way, someone convinced him of it, and he simply never questioned it again. This is the story of how he found out just how wrong he was. Eli lived on the edge of a small farming village, surrounded by hills and wide, open fields. As a child, he had been small for his age, slower to grow than the other boys, and often the last one chosen for anything that required strength. His older cousin, Roan, never let him forget it. "Stay back, Eli, you'll only get hurt," Roan would say, whenever there was heavy lifting to be done, or a fence to be repaired, or wood to be split for winter. At first, it sounded like kindness. Over the years, it started to sound like the truth. By the time Eli turned 16, he had stopped trying entirely. Whenever the village gathered to build something, or move something, or fix something, he stood at the edge of the group, watching, believing there was simply nothing useful he could offer. He told himself this so many times that it no longer felt like a belief at all. It felt like a fact, as solid and unchangeable as the hills around his home. Then came the flood. It happened in early spring, when the river that ran along the village swelled faster than anyone expected, rising through the night while most families slept. By morning, the water had already reached the lower fields, and it was climbing toward the row of houses closest to the bank. One of those houses belonged to an elderly widow named Myra, who lived alone since her husband had passed years earlier. When the alarm bell rang, half the village rushed toward the riverbank to help however they could, and Eli found himself running alongside them, though he had no idea what he could possibly do once he arrived. When he reached Myra's house, he found her trapped on the small wooden porch, the water already lapping at the steps below her, rising steadily. The bridge connecting her side of the field to solid ground had partially collapsed under the pressure of the current, leaving a gap too wide to simply step across, and too dangerous for her to attempt alone. Several villagers stood at the edge, shouting instructions, unsure how to close the distance safely. Eli stood among them, watching, waiting for someone stronger, someone more capable, to step forward and solve the problem the way they always had before. But nobody moved fast enough, and Myra's voice, thin and frightened, calling out for help, was the thing that finally pushed him forward before he had time to talk himself out of it. There was a heavy wooden beam nearby, part of a fence that had washed loose from a neighboring field. Without fully deciding to, Eli grabbed one end and began dragging it toward the gap in the bridge. It was heavier than anything he had ever lifted in his life, and for a moment, his arms shook and his knees nearly buckled beneath the weight. He expected to fail immediately, the way he always assumed he would. But instead, something strange happened. He kept moving. Step by step, inch by inch, he dragged the beam across the muddy ground until it finally reached the gap and settled into place, forming an unsteady but usable bridge across the rushing water. He didn't stop to think about what he had just done. He crossed the beam carefully, reached Myra, and helped her down onto it, steadying her with both hands as she made her way slowly across the water below. The moment her feet touched solid ground on the other side, the small crowd that had gathered let out a breath they seemed to have been holding the entire time. Myra, soaked and trembling but safe, turned to Eli and said something he would never forget. "I didn't know you were so strong," she said, gripping his arm. "I don't think I did either," he admitted. For the rest of that day, Eli kept replaying the moment in his mind, half expecting to wake up and realize it had been someone else who lifted that beam, someone else who crossed that bridge. But the ache in his arms the next morning told him otherwise. His body remembered what his mind had spent years denying. Word of what happened spread quickly through the village, as it always does in small places like this. People who had never once asked for Eli's help before suddenly began asking him to lend a hand with heavy lifting, fence repairs, and construction work. At first, he hesitated every single time, certain that the flood had been some kind of fluke, a burst of strength that wouldn't return when he needed it again. But slowly, with each small task he agreed to try, he discovered the strength hadn't disappeared. It had simply been there all along, buried under years of believing it wasn't. His cousin Roan noticed the change too, though he seemed almost confused by it. "I always told you to stay back," Roan said one afternoon, watching Eli help lift a fallen beam onto a wagon without much effort at all. "I know," Eli replied simply. "I believed you." Roan didn't have a response for that. Perhaps he never intended for his warnings to become the story Eli told himself for over a decade. Perhaps he simply never realized how much weight his words carried, long after they were spoken. In the months that followed, Eli slowly rebuilt his understanding of himself, one small task at a time. He wasn't suddenly the strongest man in the village, nor did he need to be. What changed wasn't his body. What changed was the story he had been carrying about it. He came to realize that strength, real strength, often stays hidden simply because nobody has ever been given a reason to test it. Sometimes it takes a flood, or a bridge that needs crossing, or a voice calling for help, to remind a person of what they were capable of all along. Years later, when younger boys in the village doubted themselves the way Eli once had, he would tell them the story of the flood, and the beam, and Myra's trembling hands gripping his arm. Not to boast, but to remind them of something important. Sometimes the only thing standing between a person and their own strength is a story they were told long ago, and simply never questioned. And sometimes, all it takes to prove that story wrong is one moment where staying back is no longer an option.